and all the organizers for putting on this great unconference. My name is Cathryn Grothe. I'm a research associate at Freedom House covering the Middle East and North Africa for our Freedom on the Net project. We've put together a really great panel today to discuss findings from this year's Freedom on the Net report, including challenges to internet freedom in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as lessons digital rights defenders can learn from these trends. So we'll start with a brief overview of this year's Freedom on the Net report. Then we're going to transfer into a panel discussion to discuss some of these regional trends. We'll then try and save a few minutes at the end for audience Q&A. I'm really fortunate to be joined by an incredible group of speakers today, all of whom contributed to this year's Freedom on the Net report. So we're joined by Haydar Hamzoz, the founder and CEO of the Iraqi Network for Social Media. Melody Kazemi is a researcher at Filter Watch, where she documents digital rights abuses in Iran. We also have Gurkan Ozturan, who recently joined the European Center for Press and Media Freedom as a medium freedom rapid response coordinator and has worked with as a journalist and advocate in Turkey. Finally, we're joined by Marianne Rahme, a legal researcher at SMEX, who contributes to SMEX's research around digital rights in Lebanon. Thanks again to the four panelists for joining us today and for sharing your insights. So can everyone see the presentation as I move along?
Yes, Freedom on the Net 2021.
Perfect. So before we get to hear from these panelists, I'm going to give a brief overview of the 2021 Freedom on the Net report and hopefully provide a little context ahead of today's discussion. So this report is our global assessment of internet freedom, or the simple notion that the same rights held by people offline must be protected online. As you can see from the title page, the central theme of this year's report was tech regulation. Each year, we work with over 80 analysts and advisors from civil society, academia, and other sectors to put together this report and assess the state of internet freedom in 70 countries. This report would not be possible without the help of these incredible analysts, and we're thankful for their expertise and partnership. I also want to more broadly acknowledge the internet freedom community, whose research, advocacy, and programmatic work have been essential in Freedom on the Net throughout the years. So, as I mentioned, we cover 70 countries around the world, which translates to roughly 88% of the world's internet users. In addition to producing a report on each country, we rank them according to 21 indicators broken into 3 categories. So, how easily can individuals access the internet, whether the internet is censored, and how fundamental rights such as freedom of expression and privacy are restricted or protected by both state and non-state actors. And the coverage period for this report was June of 2020 through May of 2021. So I'll summarize quickly some of our key findings and major score changes. We found that global internet freedom declined for the 11th consecutive year in 2021, signaling a continuing crisis for democracy and human rights in the digital age. This means that of the 70 countries that we cover, 30 declined and only 18 improved. The rest did not have an overall score change. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the biggest score declines took place in Myanmar, Belarus, and Uganda. Myanmar's 14-point score decline was the largest that we've seen in the history of this project. But it wasn't all bad news. In Ecuador and the Gambia saw the year's largest score improvements. Finally, Iceland ranked first for internet freedom, and China ranked last for the 7th consecutive year. So conducting research on this scale allows us to identify global trends and to assess how the human rights of users have shifted over the 12 years of our project. This year, we found that social media and communications platforms were blocked in at least 21 countries. This means that 46% of internet users worldwide live in countries where a platform was blocked. In at least 20 countries, internet access was disrupted altogether. It's times of political crisis, such as protests or elections, that most often lead to such blunt censorship. And unfortunately, we saw a number of internet freedom restrictions in the MENA region this year. So as you can see from this slide, all countries covered in the region rank either partly free or not free on our internet freedom scale. Internet users in all regional countries that we cover were arrested or imprisoned due to their online activities. We also saw governments across the region use intrusive surveillance technology to target activists, dissidents, and others due to their online activity. Restricting access to the internet continued to be a favorite tool of authorities during the coverage period, and I know that Melody will probably talk a little bit more about internet shutdowns in Iran later. So despite some of these numerous challenges the region continues to face, those working to defend internet freedom have seen some success. For example, a controversial cybercrime law that criminalized free expression was withdrawn from the Iraqi parliament in February 2021. In large part, this was due to pushback from civil society. However, major work still needs to be done to ensure government authorities in the region are protecting the rights of online users. Our report makes it clear that now more than ever, freedom of expression is under unprecedented strain. We documented that authorities punished internet users for political, social, or religious speech in 56 of the 70 countries that we studied. That's also a record high. Some of the most egregious cases of penalization for online content, unfortunately, came from the Middle East. So this graphic lays out all of the countries where social media users were arrested for political, social, and religious speech. As you can see, Facebook users were arrested in the most countries. For example, in October 2020, we saw a Kurdish journalist sentenced to 6 years in prison after he was arrested just days after posting critical comments about the Kurdistan prime minister on his Facebook page. But arrests are also occurring across smaller, newer platforms such as TikTok and Clubhouse. Just in the last year, we saw that a number of women in Egypt were arrested and sentenced to lengthy prison terms due to their TikTok posts. This year, we also used our Freedom on the Net research to build on the groundbreaking work on surveillance led by Citizen Lab, Amnesty International, and other civil society and news outlets. There's a booming market for military-grade surveillance tools that are low cost and easy to find at trade shows around the world. Governments in at least 45 of the 70 countries covered by our report are suspected of having access to sophisticated spyware or data extraction technology. So these tools are supplied by secretive companies like NSO Group, Cellbrite, Circles, and Finfisher. We know that authorities in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE frequently use their spyware technology to surveil and target activists and journalists. However, there's a growing fear that other countries in the region could be investing in these invasive types of technology. So, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, one of the central themes of this year's report is what we are calling the global drive to control big tech. A number of firms have an astounding ability to monitor and influence the behavior of billions of people. Governments around the world are finally stepping forward to challenge the immense power that these companies wield. Let's see. Can people see this slide? It looks like it might be stuck. Okay, I'm just going to continue on even if we don't have the slide because I'm almost done with this presentation. But yeah, basically just talking about the central theme to control big tech. We analyzed that new regulation is popping up, and our research found that some moves reflect legitimate attempts to mitigate online harms, rein in misuse of data, or end manipulative market practices. However, many force businesses to comply with undue censorship and surveillance, and we're seeing more politically motivated showdowns, and internet users are paying the price.
Ramped up their use of internet shutdowns over the last few years. The question for Melody, can you speak to this point, specifically how authorities are restricting digital rights through internet shutdowns, but also the flip side, how Iranian civil society is using the internet and social media to mobilize despite these restrictions? Sorry,
Sure.
Cathryn, I
Thank
took
you.
your part for a minute.
Cathryn, welcome back, and thank you for that presentation as far as we got in it, and thank you for the question. So this November actually marks the second anniversary of the 2019 fuel price protest, which was accompanied by a nationwide near total internet shutdown, which lasted almost a week across Iran and longer in some other regions in Iran. This was accompanied by a violent crackdown against protesters. Hundreds of people were killed, thousands were arrested and forcibly disappeared. But of course, verifying these numbers and getting these numbers was made much more difficult by the internet shutdown and the lack of transparency and accountability by the Iranian government. So we will continue to remember these significant events and the human rights violations that took place in order to bring attention to the victims of these events and also to continue the work being done to hold the Iranian government accountable and to get justice for the victims. While we haven't seen an extensive shutdown like the 2019 shutdown since then, it isn't necessarily good news for Iranians, because what we're seeing instead are a series of localized shutdowns being implemented specifically in regions where there are protests and demonstrations taking place in order to target them specifically to disrupt and disable social movements that are happening. These are much more dangerous than a nationwide shutdown, for example, because they are not easily detected by network measuring tools, and sometimes they can even go unnoticed until after the internet has been restored in the region. So it means that civil society can sometimes not be aware of it to be able to bring attention to it. And we also would need to rely on the ground local sources, which would have to put themselves at significant risk in order to get information out. But also another dangerous trend with these shutdowns is that occasionally tools and platforms and, for example, messaging apps are becoming available via the National Information Network's localized domestic infrastructure. These tools have much more significant security risks to the users, but out of necessity, some users will have to use them in order to communicate both within the country and outside the country. So these shutdowns are forcing users onto dangerous platforms, which puts them at significant risk because of these continued shutdowns, especially when they're sustained for longer periods. We even saw a shutdown as recently as yesterday evening taking place, but local infrastructure and local services were available. So these shutdowns also specifically target mobile networks, and in Iran, given that most Iranians and network penetration rates for mobile internet is way above 100% versus fixed internet, which is significantly below 20%, the effect of network shutdowns is the same as a total shutdown. But these shutdowns are really difficult to predict, given the nature of them. They can happen very quickly at very specific regions that we can't necessarily always detect, and also they're difficult to circumvent. So in terms of what civil society is doing is, these shutdowns aren't stopping protests and demonstrations happening. But what we need to do instead is that bring awareness to some technological solutions that are available, but there are always, and unfortunately so far, there are always cost or security or concerns around effectiveness of these tools. So while we introduce these tools through, for example, the Iran After Dark project, which categorizes tools based on the type of shutdown they can be used for, we also need to make sure that as users become more aware of these tools and as shutdowns are on the rise, they're more aware of the risks that are accompanied with these tools and how they can sort of reduce them and at what point to use them and what is the best way to mitigate any risks posed to them. And also, civil society can continue to look at, and as we do, is to look at the anatomy of these shutdowns, how they're implemented and when, and the trends that we see each time as shutdown is implemented, which can help us to perhaps look into better, more effective technological tools, which is an area which requires more work. So I think I'll stop there if that's okay, but I can expand later in the question and answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Melody, and thank you all for sticking with us through some technical difficulties. I want to turn next to Iraq, where we know the situation is slightly similar. Iraqi and Kurdish authorities shut down the internet or block social media during times of protest. However, it does seem as if authorities kept the internet on during the recent Iraqi elections. Haydar, how does this give you any hope that authorities may be starting to protect internet freedom in Iraq? And more broadly, what are some of the trends that you've been following in terms of restriction to online mobilization?
Thank you so much, Cathryn, for your efforts to build the reports and including Iraq this year for the first time when it comes to the freedom of the internet. I'm very excited and very great opportunity for us to give us a clear image, not for the Iraqis, but also for the world about what's happening in Iraq. And while we are talking, there is also a big movements in Kurdistan region, north of Iraq, specifically in Suleimaniya city. Also, Iraqi Kurdish people, they are facing struggling and peaceful street with what they have a peaceful protest, and they are facing a brutal attack from the police there. Does that give us any hope from the Iraqi government? Yeah, no, of course. Let's back to the background of the Prime Minister of Iraq. He's was the head of Iraqi intelligence agency, and they work specifically to collect information. So the style of work is different here. The strategy is different. Instead of internet shutdown, they are trying, and because they also face a big campaign to boycott the election, so they try to keep the internet online to just keep the momentum and encourage Iraqis to go and participate in the election. But that did not give me any hope when it comes to the internet protection. It's the opposite totally, because during the Prime Minister Kazemi ruled for only 1 year till now, and this 1 year is one of the most year that a lot of e-digital services are provided by the government. And these digital services, most of it's about collecting too many information from Iraqis in a not a secure manner, starting from COVID-19 vaccine, to take an appointment and take the vaccine, moving to the Iraqi passport. Imagine if you want to apply for an Iraqi passport, you are not on an HTTPS. That's the very basic thing you need, to follow to secure the information of Iraqis. All the information is still published online. When you being hired in the Ministry of Defense, or so that's the most concern I have in my from when it comes to Iraq. It's the data that's shared everywhere, and the biometric data that's collected also from the telecommunication company when you buy a SIM card, or when you go for voting. And your biometric card data, even your eye signature, also stored in an insecure way.
Thanks, Haydar. Yeah, definitely biometrics are kind of an emerging thing that we're going to want to keep watching. So kind of sticking on this theme of restrictions to mobilization, let's move to Lebanon, where authorities don't resort to internet shutdowns quite like we see in Iran or Iraq. Marianne, I know SMEX has done a lot of work on this topic around online mobilization and restrictions to digital rights. What are some of the trends that you're seeing, especially given some of the recent protests in Lebanon? Marianne, are you able to turn your microphone on?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
For some reason, I can't unmute. Okay,
I can hear
it's
you.
unmuted. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you, Cathryn, for the presentation. Thank you, Brett and Ned, for the session. Thank you to everyone who stopped during this technical problem, and thanks to all the panelists for the great work that they're doing every day. So to answer your question, in recent years, civil society organizations and individual actors have used internet as the primary tool to extend the reach of national awareness-raising campaigns. We've witnessed important campaigns for numerous causes, including most notably the campaign after the Beirut blast, and that turned later on into one of the biggest protests in Lebanon. Other campaigns that I could cite would be, for example, the investigation related to the Beirut blast, the central bank governor's decisions, everyday Lebanon. The list goes on. In recent protests in Lebanon, as online mobilization became more and more prominent, the authorities started to prey on digital spaces to try and limit these demonstrations. as they would, for example, follow all prominent activists and newly formed political groups on social networks to know about demonstration, about who's making decisions, who's leading every group, in order to intimidate these activists in an attempt to shut down protests. They would like monitor their social media account, their whereabouts in protests, send people to take pictures of them, etc. And then they would summon them for interrogations related to either their presence in protests or their digital activism online related to this. We'll get more into this, I think, later on, but that's what I had to say.
Great. Thank you so much for those comments, Marianne. So let's move to Turkey, where internet freedom has really been on a downward trend in recent years. It's dropped 20 points in the last 10 years, according to Freedom on the Net findings. Gurkan, can you talk about some of the obstacles online users, journalists, and activists face in Turkey? As a journalist yourself, have you found that this decline in internet freedom has impacted your work? And what do you think will need to be done to ensure the safety of online users in Turkey?
Hello, Cathryn. It's really great to be here finally after the connection problems. But to be very precise and quick, to answer your question, the problems in Turkey, at the very beginning, you said that the offline rights must be protected online. But in Turkey, this and in many other places as well, this has been intertwined. And in fact, the online rights are not really separate from the offline rights. So what happens in Turkey is the lines have been blurred. When people exercise their online rights, when people exercise their internet rights, or whenever they express themselves on the internet, they are facing repercussions of these actions. When someone expresses themselves, right now we can see that there are hundreds of thousands of cases in the judicial processes that people are facing detention, arrests, or investigations, or possibly time in prison for insult to president, insult to the state, etc. All these problems that have existed back in the 90s, back in the 80s, or even before that, they now seem to have a more digital phase, that the surveillance mechanisms are working on this. And what is more worrying is that it is not only the surveillance mechanism that is established by the state, but also the watching eye of the partisans in the society, that people started turning against each other, and polarization is playing an incredible role in this. In the media, of course, this is also to be expected, that similar things happen. Polarization in the society is reflected in the media. Currently, more than 95% of the media in Turkey is controlled either directly or indirectly by the government, while there is a 5% of a very disintegrated, critical or independent media that does not have the same exact capacity nor the funding to sustain their work, but they are under constant monitoring. They are being subjected to all kinds of harassment, especially women journalists online are facing this harassment. And beyond that, physical attacks against journalists is showing an increasing trend. As you can also see in the Turkey chapter of the Freedom on the Net report in recent years, journalists are being subjected to physical violence on the street because of their online comments or online statements or the articles they publish, mostly online again. And this is a concerning issue. And aside from that, there is a very interesting other element at play. Previously in the 90s, we would again see a whole region be subjected to a kind of treatment, in a way punishing them for their voting behavior or for their political habits. But in this day and age, in the 2020s, now we see an increase in the power cuts regionally when a group of people in a certain area are announcing online that they do support this or that view, or they disagree with this and this decision of the government. And this is a very interesting phenomena I see in recent years. But what we see today are actually more daring attacks against rights after people started to express themselves more and more on the internet, on digital platforms. However, in the field of media, While this is a growing concern, it is also my hope that this will not be the case in the coming years. However, again, looking at the developments in recent months, people keep asking me why Turkey is continuously losing points on the Freedom on the Net reports. And I keep telling them that these are the developments in the country. Currently, there are more than 150 new entries to be placed in the 2022 report. And looking at these, people keep telling me that these are not new developments, that they have already existed. Yes, unfortunately, they have existed before, and they are making a comeback, and they are coming stronger.
Thanks, Gurkan. Yeah, it really is it's a concerning trend. And I think keeping with this idea of personal safety for online users, Haydar, from your experience leading the Iraqi network for social media, what are some of the biggest threats to social media users, bloggers, online activists in Iraq? And have there been any like positive developments that your organization has been tracking?
Yes, I think one of the biggest threats they are facing that is the lack of digital security awareness, especially the basic security. That's a big issue we are facing, and we put plans as a civil society organization to fill that gap. Also, we are facing, as I said, I mentioned about the biometric data that collected from the Iraqi government and the content moderation by the social media companies. It's a big issue. We can see that. I mean, there is example of Facebook who they are trying to collaborate or at least listen what's happening, what's the challenges, and there is on the other side the Telegram who they have zero response to civil society organization, and we are facing hate speech, death messages on this platform. So there is no, I mean, global standards they follow to protect the users, and we see there is a difference of dealing with the standards, like double standards from a region to another region, and we know we are on a one platform. We see what's happened to the Palestinian people when it comes to the content censorship. For the positive things, we see there is an increase of awareness when it comes to the digital rights. So we see people, they are rejecting internet shutdown, and they are trying to fight back the hate speech online. So we are not alone. We feel back in 2012 when we start INSEM working on digital rights. Everyone say, "What is digital rights? Is that internet part of my human rights? What does bloggers means?" All these unfamiliar terms and unfamiliar opinions. But now in 2021, the situation is different. It's better than before, and it will be better in the future. And that's because of not just of the civil society in Iraq, but also the collaboration we are doing regionally, like working with CEMEX in Lebanon and working with other organizations like Access Now, Freedom House, to focus on that and start, providing more tools. And I remember Cathryn helped us a lot to translate the report into Arabic, because we felt this is very important to have these kind of reports in local language so Iraqis can read it and they can, understand the situation of the freedom of internet in Iraq.
Thanks for those kind words, Haydar. And yeah, I mean, the collaboration with other digital rights groups, that point you make is so important. But yeah, I think that this theme of, digital security and harassment, we're seeing this around the region. I mean, particularly in Lebanon, we've seen this kind of concerning increase in the number of physical attacks against online users. Marianne, what do you think might be driving this trend that we've seen? Lebanon has such a vibrant civil society working on these issues. Can you tell us about some of the key threats to online expression that you and SMEX are looking at? Marianne, I don't think we can hear you.
He's not muted, but
No.
there's technical issue.
Okay, I may skip ahead, Marianne, and if you get your sound back, just let us know, okay? So while Marianne is figuring that out, I'm gonna switch a little bit. Melody, can you talk a little bit about how authorities in Iran have sought to control the online space? I mean, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about projects like the National Internet Network and other pieces of legislation that might restrict free speech online. Is there anything international or domestic companies can do to kind of push back against some of these restrictive laws that we're seeing in Iran?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the biggest piece of news in digital rights and internet freedom in Iran has been the so-called user protection bill, which sort of came back to Parliament around 6 months ago. And the name is a bit of a misnomer because it actually does nothing to protect users, but it's actually just a piece of legislation which furthers the National Information Network project. It requires international platforms to comply with local laws and have local representatives or face being filtered. It also reduces the role of the ICT ministry in implementing and influencing ICT policy and giving it to a different body, which is much less accountable, as well as sort of in reintroducing the concept of legal and nationally sanctioned VPNs and requiring Iranians' data to only be processed locally. But this piece of legislation has had a long history, even though it sort of caused a lot of outrage both from activists and the tech sector and ordinary users in Iran and internationally. It has had a long history in terms of the Supreme Council for Cyberspace, which is Iran's top policy-making body, which has been implementing a lot of resolutions which form the basis and form the sort of infrastructure, as it were, for the articles contained in this bill. So this is important because what is actually contained in this bill that is suddenly causing a lot of concern and outrage has actually been in process for a very long time. So if we look at all the resolution that the Supreme Council for Cyberspace has passed, it already sort of points us to all these changes Iran wants to make. So I think in that sense, it's important to understand the sort of policy-making process in Iran and where it comes from, but it also is not a lot about immediate changes, where it's more about long-term planning on how the national information will develop. And it's not about a single issue such as cutting access to the international internet or filtering all international platforms, but it's also it's a whole ecosystem of internet restrictions that requires, for example, domestic platforms to provide incentives for Iranians to use them. And of course, these domestic platforms have connections to the Iranian government and get financial support, or whether direct or indirectly owned by the Iranian government. So it puts them in a more vulnerable position, but it's not about just getting them to outright replace international platforms, but it's this insidious way where it forces users to go onto these platforms by, for example, recently offering vaccine appointments through one of these domestic messaging apps, making users much more susceptible to be able to download them. And things such as legal VPNs, which can be used to implement this system we call layered filtering, where different people are given different levels of access to the international internet based on legal VPNs, which the government will have to sanction and will approve the user for a certain VPN based on their societal status or type of work they do and who they are. So there's all these long-term plans that need to be understood when it comes to legislative work in Iran and internet policy in Iran. But also in terms of international tech platforms, sanctions have had a great effect on how Iranians are able to access tech as well. So while on the one hand they have the government filtering platforms, tech sanctions have also meant that a lot of international tech companies sometimes act protectively and prevent Iranian users from using their platforms, and in fear of potential backlash or sanctions against the companies themselves. And there is little transparency towards the users about why they're suddenly being cut off from these platforms, whether there is an actual direct effect of sanctions or whether there's an over-compliance issue. And also this means that they are much more likely to then have to move to domestic platforms instead, which is they see as more reliable because there isn't a chance that they could suddenly be cut off. So, for example, the Google Play Store has been removing Iranian apps periodically, which continue to be available domestically, but sometimes these coincide with security and privacy violations that happen on these apps that come to light. And that lack of transparency towards users means that the users cannot be able to tell whether this platform is being removed due to sanctions or if it's being removed for a security violation. So we need much more transparency in those terms in order to help empower Iranian users and help them protect themselves. And another thing I'd like to add is not just tech companies, but internationally, when it comes to laws and regulations affecting the internet, if they're being developed in the global north or democratic countries where they have users have the benefit of certain protections and the rule of law, these pieces of legislation and regulations do not just apply to that specific country anymore. It can cause a ripple effect, and it can be copied elsewhere across the world where these protections aren't available for users, and that same legislation can be replicated that can damage and harm the users. For example, whether it's real name policies and ID verification for using certain platforms, content moderation, or criminalizing disinformation, misinformation sharing online. So I think more attention should be paid on how these laws, no matter where they're being developed, can cause harmful effect elsewhere, despite potential good intentions where they're actually being implemented.
Thanks so much, Melody. Yeah, that's a great reminder that these laws are not one size fits all, and they have to take into the context the internet freedom environment in the countries they're being implemented in. Marianne, how are we doing? Is your speaker working again? Still don't think I can hear you. Okay, well, Marianne continues to figure that out. That's actually kind of a nice transition, Melody, what you're talking about, into kind of a similar, trend in terms of legislation that we're seeing in Turkey. Last October, we saw a very restrictive social media law get enacted, and it sounds like another law, like Melody was saying, criminalizing fake news is also in the works. Gurkan, how has the social media law impacted free speech online in Turkey, not just for journalists and media outlets, but also for ordinary social media users? And are there any implications for the future of online expression in Turkey if this new fake news law were to be passed?
Well, the existing legislation in Turkey is actually dating back to 2007. Since then, it has been deepening and widening, and it is just expanding its scope. Originally, it was aimed at supposedly protection of children on the internet. However, very quickly, it turned into some form of a protection for the government on the internet. There have always existed regulatory bodies in Turkey in terms of protecting the government and its position in any kind of media platform. In the 90s, it was the TV. In the 80s, it was the radio. In the 70s, it was targeting of the newspapers and journalists. And decade by decade, we can go back to the Ottoman times and towards even to the invention of the printing press. And when we look at the applications in Turkey, actually, this legislation now does not really differ from what has happened 200 years ago in the same geography. That these kind of regulations, laws, restrictions, and all kinds of measures basically are replicating each other, just that they are using more modern terminology and modern tools. What we have been living with in the country is over the past years. You have asked beyond the journalists, but then again, I will revert back to media and journalism, because in the past year, we have conducted a study. We have monitored the impact of this report on independent media, and this is also reflected in the Freedom on the Net report. And in this report that covers the first 7 months of the legislation, we have found that over 650 news articles have been removed from their sources. This means more than 3 articles per day, and considering that majority of these are concerning investigative journalism and news about corruption, misuse of power, irregularities and violations in terms of financial management, we can clearly say that it is basically targeting anyone who might be investigating corruption cases in the country, or at least corruption claims. And then again, when we look at the sources of removal orders, they are coming from either high-level bureaucrats, ministers, or business people. So there seems to be a pattern in this. And when we look at how the individual lives of citizens are being shaped and impacted by this law, we can also see that, especially in the recent days with the plummeting of the Turkish lira has lost more than 15% value in the past few days only. And these developments are not that detached from the censorship of investigations concerning corruption cases. So a whole country is now being taken under this legislation, and by restricting the articles that were investigating these issues, we have been seeing that the information that may come afterwards is also being barred from coming into existence or reaching out to relevant people, and several other investigations get suspended as well. And as a result, what we see today is an economy that is in pieces. But what this legislation is actually targeting is the pluralism in the media and the society, because it is forcing people to take all their information from one source, and whatever the government says will be true or will be assumed to be true. And factuality is being monopolized with legislations like these. And the misinformation or disinformation law that is currently supposedly being drafted, because we are completely being left in the dark by the palace, it is being written supposedly in the palace. Even the ministers or members of the parliament, regardless of party orientation, they have no idea what this is going to include. If this legislation comes into existence, one of the major problems is going to be who is going to decide on what is false and what is true, and how is this going to be put into the judicial system, and whether or not people will be taken to court and imprisoned as the government has been promising for their statements. And if we look at the score of this government, of course, we can see that this is going to be used as a political mechanism. Even though they started out with supposedly legislation that would protect children online, they ended up protecting themselves online. Similarly, they will probably be hunting down opponents or critiques online again. And beyond this, there is a second development now that is targeting the independent media that has been receiving support from international organizations or funders. And basically, when the two of these are combined, we can see that there is a clear attempt to close down or completely silence alternate voices or independent media in the country. But the legislation that has come into existence last year, this now has a very big deviation from the ones before, because this time this legislation includes content removal orders, unlike the access blocking orders of the previous ones. Because right now, up until last year, many users would say, I am using a VPN service, I'm using a proxy server, so I can access the information no matter what, it doesn't bother me. But this time, it is the content removal order that is going to delete the very content that the users are going to look at. So this is deleting the digital memory, and this is posing a secondary problem for 3 decades from now, because by then, if a similar mistake is to be made, people will no longer have a chance to go back to 2020s and see that we have already made this mistake and learned from it. Let's not do it again. They will not have this opportunity. And deleting the digital memory is equivalent of medieval burning down of the libraries. But also answering your first question in the previous part, what needs to be done in order to ensure safety of security of users online? It is immediately to work on Digital Rights Act. Because what we currently have is a regulation that is focusing on publications on the internet beyond creating mechanisms to ensure safety of the state and its apparatus on the internet. We should actually be focusing on the rights of the users on digital spaces. And we need to keep working on expanding the understanding of digital literacy and try to enhance the understanding for respect for pluralism and basic social principles. Basically, we need a new digital social contract to coexist online.
Yeah, you just made some really, really good points there, Gurkan. Marianne, I know we're running close to time, but I want to see if your speaker's working one last time. You want to try talking? Oh, no. I don't think we can hear you. Marianne, if you want to put any comments you have in the chat so people can read it. And yeah, I see that Haydar is putting in some of our Freedom on the Net reports. So we have 2 minutes left. I thought I would just quickly, first of all, thank you to all the panelists for being here and contributing not only to Freedom on the Net, but to this session. It was really great to have your insights. I just want in our last 2 minutes to see if there are any questions from the audience. You can either, if possible, maybe you're not able to unmute, but you could type them in the chat and I can read them out. And if we don't have any questions, maybe really quickly, one thing I would love to hear in just like 1 or 2 sentences from each of you is what is one of the leading, what do you think is going to be one of the like most important leading threats to digital rights, you know, in the next 2 to 5 years that we should all keep an eye on? So this could either be from your country or more regionally or globally, but if we just want to go quickly around the room, Gurkan, do you want to start just very quickly?
Digital singularity or monopolization of information is, for me, the most pressing issue for the coming periods, because controlling the narrative, controlling the discourse is going to change a lot of things. And looking at the levels of polarization in the societies today, I am in fear that this is going to become more and more prevalent in our daily lives, and it is going to start affecting more of the street life, even away from the keyboard, away from the monitors. We are heading for a future, unfortunately, that is more and more under control of informational monopolies, and beyond that, even tech monopolization. So open source and open discussion, pluralism is the way to go. Very quickly, this was it.
Melody, in 1 or 2 sentences?
Sure, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier, which is if anyone wants to look at what is happening in Iran and how it might be replicated elsewhere, is to look at the long-term planning that is happening for the future of Iran's internet, and to not focus on single specific issues like internet shutdowns or just platform filtering or just online surveillance and online monitoring, to look at how each individual component comes together to form a much more dangerous and much more effective system of internet restriction. So I think, yeah, that would be the main thing I would like to point out.
Thank you. And last but not least, Haydar, please go ahead. I think you might be on mute.
Sorry. Yes, Marianne put her comments in the comment section if you want to read it. And when it comes to my comment, I think the spyware technologies is really a very big risk to the civil society and activists. And we have seen that even if you follow all this digital security measurement, you still have this is a big threat. So I think social media companies and the operating system, like like Apple with iPhone, they need to be more transparent, and they need to protect their users, because operating system is one of the biggest issue we are faced. nowadays, especially all of us, like, I mean, depends on these operating system instead of open source systems.
Yes, definitely. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up with the point that Marianne just made in the chat, that all of this won't be effective unless, we work together, the internet freedom community, digital rights community, with this kind of single goal in hand. I think that's a really nice way to close this out. Again, thank you to Smex and to Bread and Net for organizing, and to our 4 incredible panelists. It's always a pleasure to see you and hear your very insightful remarks. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. With that, I think we'll close it down. Have a great rest of the day, and thank you again.